Welcome to the Table Podcast series with Bridget Johnson. Each month, we give you game-changing conversations about K-12 education and leadership. Join us as top educators, field experts, and administrators share actionable strategies to transform your school community. Let's dive in.
Welcome to The Table, the podcast where student-life professionals, educators, and change-makers come together to share stories, insights, and ideas for building communities where everyone belongs. I'm your host, Bridget Johnson. Today, I'm honored to welcome Dr. Dana Ainsworth, educator, researcher, and advocate, whose doctoral work in educational leadership, policy, and justice examine the trauma to prison pipeline, tracing the historic and systemic policies that heighten children's exposure to trauma and shape their behavior in schools. With over 15 years in education, including 5 as a high school English teacher, Dana now works with educators and policymakers to help them understand the root causes of dysregulated behavior and to equip them with practical strategies that interrupt cycles of exclusion. She sees students as human beings in formation, with bodies and spirits shaped by their environments that we create. Welcome to the table, Dana. How are you?
I'm great, Bridget. I'm really happy to be here today.
So good to see you. So let's jump right in. So you describe yourself as a student who struggled. If you don't mind, take us back to that. What was school like for you? When did you first realize that your experience was shaping the kind of educator you wanted to become?
Yeah, well, I absolutely never thought I would become a teacher. So that
Fair enough.
never. Was kind of stunned when I made that life decision. But by the time I was in 9th grade, I had attended, I think, like 8 different schools.
Wow.
Yes. And not great schools either. We lived in a lot of rural places. My parents were, my mother and stepdad were fundamentalist Christians. So I ended up in a lot of these sort of closet church schools that were taught by parents. And I just missed so many crucial pieces of education. So by the time I hit the public school system halfway through 9th grade, because I got expelled in 9th grade, I had so many gaps in my knowledge, but at no point at that age did occur to me that those were gaps because of my past. I just thought I was stupid, that I didn't know things other kids knew.
Yeah.
And I was falling behind and that everything was so hard for me because I just wasn't a smart kid and that I was a bad kid. I mean, I was always in trouble. I had a really intimate relationship with my principal because we spent a lot of time in his office. We knew each other well.
Very well. Huh?
He actually picked me up at home on certain days when he knew I was skipping. He would just come right on over and pick me up.
Wow.
Back in the day when teachers still did things like that, right? So it really wasn't until I became a teacher, in that shocking twist of fate, and I read the research around the relationship between childhood adversity and ADHD and behavioral issues, that I had this massive light bulb moment. I mean, really into my, late 20s, that I was like, oh my God, this might not have actually been me all these years. Yes. You spend your life thinking I'm still shaking off being the bad kid.
Yeah.
And so that has largely informed how I approach education, how I was a teacher, and absolutely propelled me down my research path. Awesome. Really, the moment I heard that study, I was like, this is it. This is where I'm going. So.
I love that. That's an amazing story. And what an amazing turnaround, right? For you to be able to have that realization and to make that connection. Because some people spend a lot more time kind of late in their life before they make that connection. And so awesome that you were able to do that. So you spent time working at a boarding school in Central Virginia, and you talked about advocating for students who reminded you of your younger self. What did that experience teach you, and where did it push up against the limits of what you could do inside a single institution? Because sometimes that can be tricky.
Yeah, it is tricky. I mean, it was a school with a 3 strikes policy. I think that policy is probably still in place, which is why, had to get out of there. And I remember, I think it was probably my second year, that there was a group of boys who were just, always in trouble, but also you could just see, I mean, I related to them so much.
Yeah.
You could see that they were thinking, they were living kind of outside the box because that's where life had put them. And I spent so much time trying to get them interested in their own education and get them invested in, just seeing the long-term picture of where this could take them. And then I think it was like 3 of them all at once got expelled. And I remember just standing in my kitchen, just sobbing at the kitchen sink. And the thing about boarding school is that, it becomes a home and a family
it's
for a
home
lot of
sweet
kids who
work.
have left. Some of those, many of the kids at this particular school ended up there as a last resort. This was a last stop for them. And so you knew, or at least I knew, that, some of them had really disrupted home lives, even abusive home lives. And the knowledge that they were going back to that after you'd invested so much in them. I mean, it just broke my heart. And it was a major turning point for me. But I remember taking this research to the administration and saying, look, we've really got to stop putting all the onus on our students and trying to understand how they get here. And it was absolute. They were just so uninterested in hearing that. So, it's really, again, like what eventually propelled me toward getting a PhD. It was like, we've really got to change the way we approach
do something different,
behavior in
right?
schools. Yeah.
So great segue into my next question in terms of your doctoral research. Examines the trauma in the prison pipeline, which I hadn't really, heard that term in that way before. So I want to talk a little bit about that. For someone hearing that phrase for the first time, can you explain what it is?
Yeah, so I'll get more into the systemic piece of it later, but
Sure.
But it takes the idea of the school to prison pipeline, which looks at a lot of the problems with discipline and how they can create a lot of huge racial gap and move kids toward incarceration. But that starts within the school. That idea there says the problem starts at school. But really, this problem starts much earlier within our actual social systems, our political systems. But let's talk about the trauma piece first, which really what we're looking at and what's so important to understand is that childhood adversity, that can be trauma, that can be childhood adversity, like even coming out of poverty, but, even parental divorce. So, it's a measurable categories. Those stressors activate a series of neurochemical and hormonal systems in our body. And when those events surpass the regulatory ability of our biological systems, our biological stress response, the body becomes overwhelmed. And we call that the toxic stress response. Why that's so crucial in childhood is because the brain is still developing and it's still very plastic. So it's creating these neural pathways. Essentially at that age, the brain it's taking in all the information around us, determining what it needs to equip itself with to survive in the world. So if it's getting the message that the world is fundamentally unsafe, then those are the pieces of the brain that are going to become the most developed. So those vigilant parts become hyperactive, and those other pieces around executive functioning, decision-making, impulse control, behavior, they become underactive. They become underdeveloped. And so that developing brain is always going through this system called synaptic pruning. Do I need these neural pathways? Do I not need these neural pathways? So when that vigilant system is on alarm all the time, then that's what it says. Let's keep these. Let's keep these systems here. Let's keep these
keep
pathways.
going. Let's keep doing it this way.
This is what's the most important for survival, because that's really what we are at the end of the day. We're biological systems trying to survive on planet Earth. Let's keep these things and chuck everything else, which is why we see all of those executive functioning disorders in students who have come out of challenging backgrounds. We see heightened ADHD, that impulsivity, addictive behaviors. And that's also why we see such a gap in who ends up in the principal's office and who ends up in those, accelerated classes, right? Who's resourced, who has support.
Yeah.
One other piece that's really important to understand about this is that supportive adult relationships can act as a huge buffer for childhood adversity and toxic stress. So when you think about kids coming out of well-resourced two-parent homes where someone's available, and when something really challenging or even overwhelming happens, there's one or two parents that are available to say, yes, this is really, really hard, but you are still safe. And you can
Yes.
borrow my sense of safety. If you can't create it for yourself, I'm here to do that. And that buffering impact, it goes so far
Huge.
for helping, support that phase of brain development. So then you think of, I was a single parent, my daughter's in college now. So then you think of single parent households where you've got one parent working all the time, and they might not be nearly as available to be present for their child, or they're working multiple jobs. And then those stressors come along, they're much less resourced. And then you can add in all of the complications of our social systems and our social structures. So that's kind of the brief version of the trauma to prison pipeline. It is a lot. It covers many different areas. So yeah.
So you trace historic and systemic policies that heighten children's exposure to trauma and shape their behaviors in schools. What are the key policies or systems that most educators don't realize are a part of this picture? I think that's important to talk about.
I love to talk about this. So I'm going to start with a number that I think is a lot of people don't even know. And so that's the fact that in 1970, the total state and prison population in America was fewer than 200,000. So hold on to that. Fast forward to the year 2000, 30 years later, and that population has increased to 1.3 million in a 30-year period. That is less than a lifetime. Right? So that's one generation has been born and made it to adulthood there. At the same time that we moved toward mass incarceration, and there were so many policies that had to get us there, right? Many policies. We saw that same movement in our education system. So we saw zero tolerance policies. We saw the influence, the input of school resource officers. Out of school suspensions doubled in that same 30-year period. And much like mass incarceration, what populations were most impacted by that? Our populations of color. So we know that then and still now, Black students are 3 times more likely to have those suspensions and expulsions than white students for the exact same behaviors. Okay. And then we look at all of the policies in that same period of time. And really, we could start all the way back at, Reconstruction, but really leading into the civil rights movement, we see all of those policies like redlining that concentrated poverty and race into urban areas. And then we decided, hey, let's really lean into funding our schools through local property taxes. So right there, we made this huge decision as a country that we were going to, by doing that, we were going to say, great, our affluent students are going to get all of these resources, and then our low-income students are not going to get them. So you've got this structure that we've created in our system, right? All these policies that have created our geographic systems, our social systems. Now think of the impact that has on a child's nervous system. So you're living in an under-resourced area, and then you attend an under-resourced school. At what point do those children get the break where somebody is holding them up and helping them feel safe and taking some of that load off their shoulders? Then they go into the schools and they're hearing this message, you're bad, you're misbehaving, you're doing all these things, when really what they're doing is exemplifying the behaviors that are inherent with the stressors of living in poverty and being under-resourced. So we've just created this vicious cycle, and it is such a tangled web now. We are so deep in it in our country. How we are going to get out of it that's an entirely different conversation. But I think it's so critically important that we begin to understand behavior in this way. If our policymakers and our educators can at the very least understand how we got here and what's informing student behavior, it drastically changes the way we respond to our students.
Absolutely. So you mentioned student behavior. So let's talk about that a little bit. So, when a student is acting out and being disruptive or even shutting down, what do you think is actually happening, or what is, not what you think, because I know is actually happening in their body and their nervous system? And how does a typical school response make it better or worse?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you a personal example on just what I experienced in high school. So I had this math teacher in 9th and 10th grade because I failed the class. I had to take it again. And she had this way of talking. I mean, the whole class was very much about control, right? But she had this way of talking that for me was very triggering. I had a really abusive mother. And so when I came into the classroom and I would experience that, it triggered all of the same, my biological system was saying, this is very dangerous and we need to go on alert. And so two things would happen. One, I would shut down and become unresponsive. And then when she would really, come at me with that voice, I would become reactive. Right. And so if we take the same kind of biological atmosphere of being, our bodies, the way they were formed, they were meant to, survive on the wild plains, right? And if we take that same environment and a child has encountered a lion when they walked into some part of the woods, then every time they go into that part of the woods, their body is going to say, hey, there might be a lion here. You're going to need to come in with your fists up and your stance in your posture to be defensive and protective, right? Yeah. And so that's this is really what's going on with students in the classroom. We see a variety of behaviors. I've had students who just shut down and their head is on their desk and they retreat inward when a challenge comes up. So as soon as something hard happens. So one of two things might be happening there. Either they haven't had enough exposure to challenge to develop those tools to move into that activated space that's required to meet challenge, or every time they've come to that place of challenge, it's resulted in some real pain for them. Right. So they have developed all of these strategies to get them through. Behavior is communication. That is the most critical thing that we have to understand about students. Behavior is communication. When kids are still developing, most of what they do is just coming in reaction and response to the environments around them. And when we act as though that behavior is intentional and we penalize it, we're not partnering with our students to help them develop the tools necessary to survive in the world. We're not partnering with them to help them see that moment of challenge as a developmental opportunity, as a moment to develop the tools necessary to meet challenge appropriately and well. So let's just take a student who becomes combative in the classroom. And as a teacher, right, we got to teach. We have a job to do, and we probably have 30 other students who need our attention. So we really can't spend a lot of time on this one student who's getting angrier and angrier because they really just don't understand this math problem. So we have a few options here, right? I mean, the way our current schools are structured, we don't even have this built in. I'd love to see our school structured in a way that this doesn't even get to a point where we have a student flipping their lid when they see a math problem. But that's not how they are right now. So let's look at how a school is right now. Okay. We can take that student, and historically our response has been to get them out of the room because we still have a classroom of students. We're going to isolate them, and usually we're going to reject them. We're going to get them out of the school eventually, right? If the student has done this a few times, that's it. Like the jig is up. You obviously don't have what it takes to be in here, and you're really posing a challenge to the classroom. You're being disruptive. So we can just remove them from the school entirely. But at minimum, we're going to remove them from that classroom. What if we say, hey, we see that you're having this moment. I see, you're really flipping your lid again over this math problem. And what I understand is that you don't yet have the tools to approach this challenge the way you need to. So let's get you into an environment that can give you those tools. Maybe we have that breakout room where you can go sit with another teacher or a specialist who's there for this reason and who can breathe with you for a little bit, help get you ground zero, help get you regulated. And then we can go back to this problem. And let's break down why this particular problem is causing this whole reaction. Let's walk through that and really equip that student with the regulatory tools appropriate to respond to that. So when we do the first path, when we remove and exclude, we are drastically increasing the chances that student is going to drop out, get held back, or eventually just become incarcerated altogether. As soon as a student has out of school time, that risk of incarceration already goes up, because when they're out of school and they're not supervised, they then have room to do all sorts of further things. And we're solidifying this identity that you are bad and you're unable to, you don't have anything to bring to us as a school and to society. Right. You're not useful to society. Get out of here. So if that's the case, we're going to find somewhere we're useful, right? That's what we do as human beings. Mm-hmm. We're going to apply, we all want to be productive one way or another. We're going to apply that productive to negative things or positive things. So how we respond to that behavior has such a huge impact on the long-term trajectories of a student.
So you talked about kind of the educators taking kind of a lead role in kind of thinking about kind of what's happening here and being curious. How, I know you're passionate about helping educators understand the root causes of dysregulated behavior. What's the common kind of misread you see where educators think they're seeing a discipline problem, but it's something else entirely? And I think this happens all the time. We make assumptions about students' behavior for whatever reason, whether it's our own personal biases or whatever, and we kind of, I know what this is, and kind of, I know how I'm supposed to respond here. I'm going to check the box and move on. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because I think it's really important, especially someone who's a former dean of students. I can sometimes, I've fallen into that trap thinking I already know, and I've made assumptions, and totally wrong. Wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I still do it. And my God, even as a parent, I still do it. I still apply motive to behavior. I do it all the time. It's wild how much I know this and I still do it because it's really written into our social fabric in our country specifically.
Absolutely.
We are a spare the rod, spoil the child kind of mentality. And our idea of, individuality in America is so pronounced that everyone is responsible for everything that happens to them, right? And it's such a, so it's just so completely built into the fabric of our being. We always apply, if a student has done something we didn't want them to do, it's because they had motive. They just want to be bad, right? They're just bad kids. They're just, and I'm always encouraging teachers, especially if we start this work at the elementary age, to really get curious around what that ultimate motive was. So, let's take a student who, every time that spelling test gets set on the desk, that student is just immediately like, I can't do this. I need help. I can't do this. I need help. It's very possible that what that student has learned is that they need another adult with them. But let's take that into a behavioral way. Every time that spelling test gets put on the desk, that student throws their pencil and throws the spelling test on the floor, and they're just having a full meltdown, right? And we're just like, oh my God, that kid, God, he's such a bad kid. He's making my life so difficult. And look, he's being obstinate and he's being combative. And really what's likely happening here is that kid is feeling unequipped to take this test. They don't have the skills to face challenge. They might be feeling so completely overwhelmed that their nervous system has just flipped its lid. We call it flipping its lid, right? And they legitimately don't know. They don't have the tools to handle this situation. Right. So that's how they're going to do it, right? So when we start to do that, and then there's the other student who's just constantly, they're finding ways to actually get attention, right? And what it is that they really want is just connection.
Right.
They want a teacher to look at them and see them. And the way that they're going to do that is to either be constantly acting out or to be constantly in tears, So we've got that student who's just, why they cry 5 times a day. They really want physical connection. Yeah, they want some attention and they're not getting in their home life. And so it's coming into the classroom. So I really encourage teachers to get very curious. I know we have a million other things to do as teachers, and but getting curious about what the possible motives are. And a great way to determine that is to see what motives the student to do positive things, right? Or when you're responding and you notice that, okay, hey, as soon as I stand in proximity to this child, they calm down. So what that student is probably telling you is that they need a little more of that personal attention. So anticipating those needs and trying to meet them in more positive ways before they are presenting in these negative ways can be really helpful. But overall, yeah, I think we're all applying motive to behavior. And honestly, I think the only time that we ever really need to remove a student from school is if they are truly, truly posing danger to the school environment. Otherwise, we need to be really asking, what is it that they're trying to communicate, and what is it that they need, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And, you know, there's always this argument around, well, are schools the place for that? You know, are schools supposed to be therapy too? Are schools really supposed to be building character? What is the job of a school, right?
Right.
But what is also true at the same time is that we have not built into the social fabric of our country the necessary supports to help developing children become proficient, able, strong adults who can navigate the workforce and the social environment of this country well. So if we aren't doing it at home, or we're not doing it in our social systems, then the schools are the only place left where we do have to attend.
But you're also spending 8 hours a day at school.
Right.
And so I'm not saying that it should be an either or. In a perfect world, it's a both and, right? So you're getting that stuff both at home, but also it's being reinforced. Like, we're using the same language in both places so that it's reinforced. But if not, you're spending the majority of your time, at least, you know, from age, 6 to 18, in schools with other adults. And so
that's absolutely right. You can't extract, you're only going to do your developing when you're at home.
Right.
Like, you can't say, stop developing while you're at school.
Not right now, stop.
Yes, that's it. We're not doing that right now. This is just for learning, right?
Yeah, I'm like,
and that's kind of, that's actually the key to it. This is what we seem to, I don't know how we've gotten this far in education, and this point has not become so central to it. A student cannot learn if they are dysregulated.
Right.
We know this. Brains cannot take in information when they are dysregulated. Exactly. All of us, we as adults know this. When high conflict happens at work, and then we go back to our computer and we're just trying to answer an email, how much harder is it to just write a single little email, right? Because we just saw 3 people have a blowout in the meeting that we just left, and we're trying to figure out what we can't do that. And expecting kids to come into the classroom and learn first and foremost without seeing to these biological things that are the most basic part of being human. Right. It's the most ludicrous thing I have ever seen. And this is why, when we look at America's global standing in education, this is why we rank where we rank, because we're doing it backwards,
Right. Yeah, but the problem is, we've gotten in this kind of vicious cycle about, the pressure on standards and testing and compliance. And we feel like that is what we should be focused on. How do we help educators and administrators make the case, or how do we make the case to them that this work is worth the time and the space that it requires? Because it really is worth it.
It is worth it. I was in a workshop recently where it was a kindergarten and first grade. It was just kindergarten and first grade teachers, and the room was full. And it's often hard for me to get administrators to also come to this, but I had principal, assistant, everyone was there, and I was so grateful. And I got about halfway through, and one of the teachers said, "Well, but I have to teach." And the principal stopped. He stopped me, and he turned around and he said, "You know what? If you only did this for the first few weeks of school, you would be able to teach so much better for the remainder of the year, and I'm not going to fight you on that." And I was like, oh my God, I never hear an administrator say this, but what a win, right? Yes. What a win to hear an administrator say this. And it is so true. And look, European schools understand this, Asian schools understand this, right? If we start with these basic principles of regulation, and we get students into a place where they can take in information well, then they're going to hit those scores. They're going to achieve the way we want them to achieve. But we've got to allocate the time and the resources to do that. And that is the biggest place that we seem to be so absolutely stuck. Now, I can go down a long rabbit hole around the policies. I mean, why is it that we have all this pressure to perform to standards and testing and compliance? Because purportedly that came out of a way of ensuring that we were getting equal education, in
Got
all
it.
of our classrooms. But instead, it has just compounded
Yeah.
this problem. And to me, I see that happening because we have policymakers using education as a platform to ensure their election and to ensure seats. And that's massively problematic because
Absolutely.
they're gonna make policies based on what sounds good, what looks logically on the face, but is missing all of that scientific research. It's not research backed, it's not data driven, and that's kind of how we got ourselves into this mess.
Oh man.
So yeah.
So one of the things that you talked about, and I love this, is that the human beings in formation with bodies and spirit shaped by the environments that we create. So what does it look like when a school really does internalize that belief, when it shows up in structures and not just in the language?
Yeah.
And are you seeing a lot of that? How are we
This-
doing? Because I'm like, ooh,
this is-
I don't know
this is-
if I'm seeing that on my
I
end.
know. This is what keeps me up at night. And every time I have a conversation about creating this model and creating this space, the first thing people say is, well, yeah, as a charter school, you could do it as a charter school, right? Or one of these new micro schools. And it breaks my heart to think that we can only do this in these tiny corners that really requires some amount of resources to get to that place. It is,
Right.
even if it's a single parent household, it's a single parent household that the parent has enough wherewithal to advocate for their kid to get into this school, which means we're still leaving behind the most critical populations in
Exactly.
our public school system, right? We can do this in our public school systems. So what does it look like? And we see this to a degree with the MTSS movement. We see this to a degree. There are massive complications around really implementing MTSS with fidelity and at all three tiers. Again, a whole different conversation. But if we just started our school day with 5 or 10 minutes of silence and breathing, I can't even tell you how much that would change. Just let's think about what a child goes through in the first hours of the day. They're getting up way earlier than their biological clock says they should be. And their parents are also trying to get out the door and get to work. And it's like, get some food in your body, get clothes on. Why aren't you? Everyone's yelling. None of us are calm in the morning, right? We're all late. We're just trying to get the toothpaste out of our hair and get out the door. We're spilling coffee. So already kids are coming in with they're way up here, right? And not to mention if it happens to be raining and they're walking to school and just all the things that happen, or getting bullied on the bus. Your parents had a big fight. Your parent became abusive on the way to school. All of the things that by the time kids arrive at school, and then they're usually ushered into a gym or a cafeteria or just spaces that are loud and crowded and hot, and kids are up here already. Their nervous system is already really activated by the time they walk into a school day. How many of us have memories of walking into school and just feeling super calm and ready to learn? Right? No, right? I used to feel like I was going to throw up before I walked into school because of the social pressures and all the things I knew I was going to encounter. If we gave kids a 10-minute window to just invite them in and take all that chaos and bring it down. And if we taught them a few tools right there to say, hey, let's get ready to learn. Let's breathe. Let's feel where our body's at. Just teaching them to be able to name where their bodies are at the start of the day. Am I all the way up here at a 10, or am I here at a 2? Where am I? Do I feel like I want to punch the kid next to me, or do I want to hug the kid next to me? And if I want to punch them, then what do we need to do to get me to the place where I want to hug them, right?
Yeah.
If we just started there, if we gave our students just the ability to name where they are throughout the day, if we built into our school day regular pauses, if we gave kids more than 20 minutes to eat their lunch, my God, You know, I mean, we've got them rushing all day long, and then they go home and they have to rush more. They've got to get to sports and they've got to do homework. None of this is honoring the way our biological systems work. And really, the only schools that are doing that are the ones that are resourced. We know that the more affluent the school is, the more this is built into the structure, the more room there is for creativity and play and time. Why it is that our less resourced schools don't have as much time, it's beyond me. I don't understand. It's the same amount of hours in a school day at both schools.
Exactly.
So why is it that we get into these low income schools and no one has time, you know? So that's how we can build it into our day. You know, those tools of regulation, it's actually not that difficult. But it does take a little bit of restructuring, and it takes some thought. At the end of the day, you know, we're always reluctant to give one more thing to teachers, one more strategy, one more thing they have to learn how to do. But at the end of the day, this is one thing that I think is so, so worth it, because it makes the rest of your day so much calmer and smoother. So there's just one side note. I have a friend who taught for many years at a Quaker school, and at the Quaker school every morning they have their morning meeting, and it's 10 minutes of silence.
Silence, yeah.
And so then a teacher later in the day, at any point, they can say, "Friends, we're getting a little loud. Let's take our silence." And those kids know how to drop so fast. They just know how to do it because they've been taught to do it.
Right.
So yeah, it works. It works.
It does work. But you know, the thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking about this is that the adults need this too, actually.
Oh, yes.
'Cause there are a lot of people who can't really understand or regulate their bodies, or don't know kind of what's happening, or can't pinpoint, or can't really be kind of descriptive when things are happening with themselves. So how can they help their students regulate if they don't know how to actually regulate themselves? And so thinking about how we start with the adults, because maybe if we started there, then they would understand the value and wouldn't feel like, this is another thing that I don't even know if it's going to work, or I don't know how this is going to kind of go over in my classroom. I don't really know how to do this. I'm uncomfortable with silence. Like,
absolutely right. Oh, yes. Yeah. A lot of us are, right?
Yeah,
a lot of us definitely
wholly
are.
uncomfortable. And so thinking about, for me, as someone who works kind of mostly with adults, you know, thinking about how are we setting our adults up for success so that they can kind of take a breath and be more curious, while they don't feel like they have to check the box, or they don't feel pressure to kind of blow through the curriculum or the task at hand, because they've got to kind of meet their mark, so to speak, and the pressure that creates for them, and the anxiety that creates for them. And so they're holding that too. And then we're expecting them to like get your students to be calm. They're not calm.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I always start with co-regulation, because, you know, students will borrow their teacher's nervous system. And if ours is up there, that's what they're borrowing. Right.
Yeah.
You know, but I also think it's a survival thing. I think all of us understand we all know, all of us who have been in the hustle and the grind, that pausing can actually be kind of dangerous, because it's staying in motion that is what keeps us in motion. And the second that you stop, you're like, oh no, you know? So it is a little precarious. And I think teachers can be reluctant to do that pausing and that break, because it kind of threatens the whole tower.
The whole thing.
Come down, you know?
The whole thing.
Yeah. So there needs to be the structural support within the school day to help support this among teachers as well. And I think that's really critical. That's something a lot of administrators can do, is to find ways, you know. I always thought it was so interesting that, you know, as teachers, we would dash into school. We're all, you know, the last minute, right? We're like all walking into our classroom at the latest possible minute, and then we're getting there, and now we have to start, and we're rushing. And I always thought, gosh, it would just be so much more. I think it would just set our day so much better if we all started in a collective space and just had 10 minutes where we're just decompressing. And then maybe even kind of like, you know, just what is our goal today? What are we trying to do as a whole, as a school? Where are our priorities? What, you know, what's this week about? What's this day about? You know, and so There's definitely a lot of work that schools could do to support teachers in this.
I think so, for sure. And so, a little while ago, we were talking about kind of policy and government and how that plays a role. And so there's some real concern about the current policy environment, its impact on our next generation, our current generation, the achievement gaps widening and trauma exposure increasing. What keeps you from despair, and what is giving you hope right now?
Yeah. Well, Bridget, I live in a constant place of low-grade despair. I really do. I think anyone in the education system does, right?
It's tough. It is.
We do. I think we are all just right. No, I've got hope, and I can answer the hope question. But I think we do all. We're all sort of on the cusp of like, this could go. We don't.
Yeah, at any time. Yeah.
And I think we're kind of seeing the collapse of it right now.
Yeah.
And so to that end, what I'm really hopeful for in this kind of current state of chaos that we're seeing politically is that we become removed from the political pendulum swing, or at least education becomes removed from the political pendulum swing. Mm-hmm. Because what has happened is that we get one administration in and we go this way and then another. And education was largely immune to that until really the last few decades. And all of a sudden, education has become a major talking point, a platform point. And so it's getting sucked in this cycle. You cannot make forward momentum when you're going from left
back
to
and
right.
Forth, yeah.
Yes. And so what gives me hope? Here's what gives me hope.
Okay.
Not just for education, but for our country. Mm-hmm. We have the most diverse generation of learners coming through than has ever existed in the history of human civilization. Ever. We have never, ever, ever had a generation that is as diverse as this one now. And that was my second to last year teaching was the first class that came through that was no longer majority white. Okay. Just across the country.
Yep.
And these are the people who are going to become our policymakers, our CEOs, our leaders. And this generation has the most profound vocabulary for emotions and what's happening within us. When I was growing up, we didn't even know what anxiety was.
Right.
You were not allowed to have anxiety as a teenager. You were just a teenager, right? Like you were just a mess. That was it.
Exactly.
These kids know what anxiety is. Yeah. Are they all suffering from it in a way that, they think is cataclysmic? Yes, probably. But, that's also we forget that anxiety is a developmentally normative part of adolescence. But they have this language. This is a generation of kids who go viral on TikTok for talking about mental health. Mm-hmm. That's incredible.
Yeah, that is.
The ability to understand these processes. I think some of our, more ancient civilizations had these processes and these language built in very different ways, but they didn't have the science behind it. These kids have the science behind it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's profoundly amazing. And I find that incredibly, incredibly hopeful. That's what gives me hope each day.
I appreciate that. That's a good one. So Dana, for the principal or the head of school or the superintendent who's hearing this, I'm like, okay, I got to do something here. What's the first step? Like, what's some low-hanging fruit for these folks so I can just kind of get them on the path and moving in the right direction?
Yeah, low-hanging fruit. Thinking about the structure of your school day, just thinking about the ways that transitions between classes, how classes are starting, especially in elementary environments, really start to think about your school as just walking nervous systems. Okay. And then think about how your school is heightening that stress or bringing it down and creating a grounded place to really that's really conducive to learning. So that's the first step. And I would read everything I could on the developing nervous system.
Gotcha.
That's where I'd start. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So for an educator or policymaker who's just discovering your work, where's the best place to start and how can people connect with you?
Yeah, my website is tomorrowhouse.co, and I'm happy, I go into schools and help teach just really basic tools that teachers can implement pretty quickly. And then I can also do that larger work of working with administrators and implementing nervous system tools. I'm building out schools that are very, have the nervous system in mind throughout the daily parts. So, yeah.
Awesome. Dana,
yeah.
Thank you so much for being here today. This conversation about what it actually means to see students as full human beings and what it takes to build systems worthy of them is exactly the kind of thinking this table needs and what we need to be talking about. And so I'm so grateful for your research and your advocacy and the urgency you bring to this work. If you want to learn more about Dana's work, we'll include the links in our show notes. And if you're not already following us on Instagram and TikTok, search for Dean's Roundtable on both platforms. We'd love to see you there. And if you're enjoying the table, please subscribe, share it with a friend, or leave us a review. It really helps more people find us. And thank you so much for pulling up a chair to the table today. I hope this conversation gave you something to think about, or maybe even something to try in your own community. And as always, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time at the table. Have a good one.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Table Podcast Series. Is your student life program delivering on your mission? Our new K-12 student life assessment moves you beyond anecdotes to evidence-based decisions. Through comprehensive stakeholder surveys and expert analysis, you'll get concrete insights across 8 essential dimensions of student life, from culture and wellness to staff effectiveness and resource allocation. We're seeking founding partner schools to be the first to experience this transformative assessment process and help shape the future of student life evaluation. Today's episode was hosted by Bridget Johnson in conversation with Dr. Dana Ainsworth, produced and edited by Andrew Sigmund, and music by PremiumBeat.com. For any questions, contact information can be found in the episode description and